So 3, 2, 1. All right, we are live. Hello, everyone. I see you all are already engaging in the chat. That's amazing. I'm Natalia Buchwald. I'm here at Tech Change in Washington, D.C., home office. Happy International Women's Day to all of you. And I'm so thankful that you chose on this wonderful and busy day to tune into our Gender Data Impact and Innovation series. So today is day 2 of this series, and by no means does that mean that you had to come to day 1 or take our Gender Data 101 course, but I definitely highly encourage checking those resources out as well, maybe after this panel or after these workshops. Just really great to see some familiar faces in the chat and also new people as well. So I see you all are tuning in. Hopefully you can hear me loud and clear. We have people all over the globe, and I know some people are tuning in at really early hours or really late hours, including some of our panelists today. So I'm just so grateful that you are coming in. But once again, these events will be recorded. So if you're a little sleepy or tired, you can definitely use them as a resource later on and check out our recordings. So let's just get started. I think just today at a glance, I'm super excited. We have not 1, but 2 featured panels today. So we're kicking off today with basically feminist data governance. And then our next panel is actually a showcase of applications of gender data. And so after these 2 featured panels that you can view here on our main stage, you will be able to navigate to our agenda tab and explore our interactive workshops. And we have 4 interactive workshops today, and I'm really excited for all of them. So I think I really don't want to waste any time. I'm so excited for today's first panel. We have Lorena Fuentes here from Ladysmith. Ladysmith is a feminist consultancy, and additionally, we have Catherine D'Ignazio, who is the co-author of Data Feminism, which I actually have right here. I'm just so excited to have the chance to talk to these wonderful women today. And I'm just going to pass it immediately. So for both Lorena and Catherine, would you introduce yourself and how you came to the role that you are working at now? So we'll start off with Lorena.
Great, thank you so much, Natalia. It's such a pleasure to be here and certainly to be sharing the panel with Catherine D'Ignazio. My name is Lorena Fuentes, and I am the Director of Practice and Advocacy at Ladysmith. As Natalia mentioned, Ladysmith is a feminist research collective. We help international organizations to collect, analyze, and take action on gender data. My co-founder, Tara Cookson, and I started Ladysmith back in 2016, fresh off of our PhDs, in Tara's case on cash transfers in Peru, and in my case on femicide in Guatemala. And at that time, she and I were both really grappling with the core lessons of our research, which relied on feminist methods and theories of change. But we were also equally grappling with the core lessons and learnings from working in the gender-based violence advocacy sector. And we felt sort of very passionately that gender data is political. And of course, when we refer to gender data, we're talking about any information, research, knowledge about gender or gender inequalities. You know, for us, and I think for most people, gender data is not synonymous with information about women. It's not synonymous with sex disaggregated statistics. And so broadly speaking, Tara and I felt somewhat uneasy with the thesis that data gaps were the primary drivers of inequalities. And we questioned the assumption that collecting more and more gender data would necessarily catalyze action, because we saw how ongoing gaps in things like political will, resource allocation, and frankly, empathy were really barriers to driving progress and change around gender-based violence, for example. But in the period when we completed our PhDs and went on to start Ladysmith, new digital technologies and donor trends had really catalyzed this like global data movement, particularly in the space of development. And so Tara and I resolved that one way that we could, affect positive change in this space was to bring the rich insights from decades of feminist research across the global South and global North to bear on this topic of gender data and data governance. And so this included the understanding that if just as gender data is political, so too is data governance. And if we believe that we need more data in order to support movements or actions for gender equality, we have to make sure that data governance aligns with the core principles, feminist principles. And that, for one example, is to amplify the voices of marginalized populations rather than expose them to harm. So I'll end there.
Yeah, thanks Natalia for hosting, and it's also a pleasure to share the Zoom with Lorena. So yeah, for me, I've had sort of a windy path to where I am now. I'm currently a professor in a department of urban studies and planning. But the way that I sort of came to data feminism was as in a kind of dual background as both a software programmer. So like I spent almost 15 years as a freelance programmer, which paid the bills while I was an independent artist. So that's my other hat that I wore for a long time as an independent artist and designer, and always had a really strong connection to maps. So I was making maps and also making counter maps, and there's like a whole world of folks that have been thinking about counter mapping and counter cartography, feminist mapping and feminist cartography for a long time. And so some of these things culminated for me when I was a graduate student at the MIT Media Lab, and this is in the early 2010s. And this is like the height, I would say like peak big data was happening at this time, where like everyone at the lab, certainly all the like corporate folks who came to visit, a lot of the public speakers were talking about big data, big data, big data, and all these things that were going to be opened up. But having been kind of come up in this world of counter mapping, where there's always, or at least in my experience, there was always talk of maps and power and the ways that maps reproduce power and who makes maps and all these things. I was very surprised in my world, at least, that nobody was asking these kinds of questions about the data themselves. There also didn't seem to be a big conversation about power in relation to data visualization. And so it really felt like it was the right time to start thinking about issues of power. And of course, like not in any way alone, like even as Lauren and I were writing the book, Data Feminism, there's been just, I think, a huge and wonderful explosion of critical data work that has sought to really push back against a lot of the techno-heroic narratives of big data that exposes some of the racial bias, the gender bias, the numerous biases, and also works to show how many of our data-driven systems are sort of reproducing an unequal world, a sort of unequal status quo, and really starting to ask questions about who they serve. But that's sort of what led us to write Data Feminism, is because we were seeing that there was this we inherit this legacy of feminist thinking, and which is exciting. And I hope Lorena would agree too, because it sounds like your all's work uses so much feminist intellectual work. Like we inherit all that work. It's like a heritage that we can draw from. And for us, we're like, we need to introduce people who are working in data science and these sort of more technical disciplines to all of the things that we can learn from feminist thinking and theory to be applied today, because they're all so relevant. And in fact, if we pay attention to feminist thought, then it can instruct us as to how to proceed, like not only to critique sort of what's wrong with big data and how it's racist and sexist and classist and so on, but also to think about, well, what do we do from here? Like, how do we go forward to right the balance of power in the world according to these feminist principles? So that was really the underlying motivation for the book, is to kind of introduce intersectional feminism to folks working in data and say, hey, there's a lot to be gleaned here. And yeah, so.
Awesome. Thank you so much for your introductions. I am going to go into the question that's actually the title of our panel for today, arguably the most important one of the day, right first. So what is feminist data governance? I'm Lorena. What is feminist data governance?
Thanks, Natalia. Yeah, I mean, I'm going to give one response, but I'm not going to pretend this is a monolith nor a settled conversation. I think that when I was discussing with my Ladysmith colleagues last week, how should I frame this my response to this question? And we were all in agreement that it's best to kind of refer to experience, and certainly as a collective of academics who also have shaped sort of some of our own feminist principles about how to do research and advocacy. That was one kind of place to draw from, but more specifically, we are the designers and implementers of our own gender data project, through which we've constantly had to grapple with issues of feminist data governance. And so in the spirit of show don't tell, Cosas de Mujeres is the project I'm referring to, and it's a digitally supported gender data intervention that broadly falls under an initiative that we call Gender Data Kit, which is a set of technologies, feminist methods, and resources for gender data projects. And we piloted Cosas de Mujeres in the Colombian city of Cucuta, which borders Venezuela. And there we're using WhatsApp, which we know through research women actually have on their phones. We're using WhatsApp to connect women to services that prevent and respond to gender-based violence in the context of the largest migration flow in recent history. And through the messages that our social workers who manage this platform receive, Cosas de Mujeres serves this additional purpose. So in addition to connecting women to essential services, it generates actionable data that we then leverage to advocate for improved gender-based violence services and policy responses. And so it's through this project that Ladysmith has actually been crafting and reshaping our own feminist design principles, which dovetail into the sort of governance piece. And so broadly speaking, these principles are that, you co-design with local women's organizations. So when there's any type of gender data project, when you're doing research, whether it's for academic or practitioner purposes, there are local women's movements everywhere in the world. So start by listening to them. And so co-designing with grassroots women's organizations is a key principle of feminist data governance for us. The second is that you shouldn't collect data for data's sake. More data is not always better. And certainly you shouldn't collect data just because a donor is demanding it. There has to be another litmus test for why you're doing it. Third, you have to meet women's immediate needs. So while the project I just referred to, there's the two components, right? There's the connecting women to services, and then there's generating what we hope is actionable data so that we could advocate for positive change. That component is sort of linked more to the medium and long-term change. But in any project such as this, you have to focus on meeting immediate needs. Fourth is data and harm minimization, and I'm happy to get into a few examples later, but basically, what are the minimum data points, and those don't have to just be quantitative, like qualitative data points that you need in order to generate like a robust picture of what's happening. 5 is, again, to amplify the voices of the quote unquote data subjects and their allies. And finally, I think certainly in the space of feminist data or data governance, it's to not mistake technologies for solutions. They can potentially be tools when used, within certain parameters and with certain, I think, principles in mind, but they're not solutions. And so these are the, for us, our feminist approach to data governance informs what data is collected, what the threshold is for deciding that data does need to actually be collected. And it also then shapes how we manage and protect and distribute that data through our various research and advocacy outputs. So it's many things. I think broadly speaking, it's thinking of the different guideposts and thresholds that you need to meet in order to proceed with even collecting data, and then using those similar principles to decide how is that data going to be managed and leveraged, hopefully, for affecting positive change.
Thank you. And Catherine.
Sure. Well, +1 to everything that Lorena just said. And like a lot of what Lorena said dovetails with the principles that we outline in data feminism significantly. So I think maybe one thing that's helpful to think about when we're saying feminist data governance is to be thinking about what is that a kind of reaction to or an alternative to. And what it's an alternative to is kind of normal and mainstream data practices, which all too often operate on a kind of more extractive model. And that goes across sectors. So whether we're talking about academic research or international development or other kinds of worlds and practices, like too often, if we look at what we call in the book who questions. So like, who is collecting the data? Who are the data about? Or who are the data subjects? Whose values are being operationalized? For what purpose? Who ends up getting to see the data? And so on and so forth. Too often when you answer those who questions, it's basically more elite people from more dominant groups are sort of extracting data from communities, often not ever returning to those communities to share back any results. And the knowledge, whatever knowledge is sort of gleaned from the analysis or processing or use of the data is then located sort of outside of the community. So it's like a very extractive model of knowledge production. And so I loved all the principles that Lorena was saying, how those work to try to pull the knowledge back to the places from which it comes. And so I think sort of writing that balance is one of the sort of key things. And the way to start is by doing that kind of analysis of power in the whatever context that you're working in. Let's see, what else did I want to say? Yeah, I think, maybe the other thing I would add is for me, and I think increasingly for folks who are sort of going under a feminist umbrella, what this also means is attending to not only women and women's experiences, but gender broadly, right? So thinking about trans and non-binary gender identities, which does not mean you necessarily always collect that data, because like we're talking about here, those data can often lead to harms or expose vulnerable communities to folks that would target them because of taboos and stigma around gender identity. But thinking through at each stage, like, there's not just women and girls, but we're also kind of have this more expanded conception of gender, including also looking, sometimes the best way to understand gender inequality is also to study men. So also looking at kind of masculine gender identities. And then of course, thinking of intersectionality when we're thinking of gender data. So for any given context, so like one of the principles in data feminism, which I think is again working to take data that's extracted and ground it back into context, one of the principles is to consider context. And so thinking about the ways in which often, it can never be just that kind of gender inequalities explain everything, right? There's all sorts of other inequalities that are in play in any given context or situation. So attending to what those are, and those may look really differently depending on the situation. Like they may be religious divisions, they may be class inequalities, racial inequalities, and so on. And then maybe the final thing I'll say around feminist data governance is thinking through practices of, even for the people who are working with the data, these institutions who are maybe collecting data and storing that data, is thinking through how we care for those data, like in that sense of like maintenance actually, and valuing that kind of maintenance work that often gets overlooked. Like we talk about this a little bit in the book, but like there's this like image of the data scientist, and often we use these metaphors of like the data scientist is a unicorn, they're a ninja, they're a rock star, they're these like cowboys that like go into data and like do some fancy stuff with it, and then they like produce these amazing results. But instead of thinking about that that model, you know, kind of pushing back against that, what frankly is silly and like that like doesn't happen anywhere model, is really thinking about like how do we develop these like sort of networks of care and maintenance and sustenance for data, particularly when data are about people, which don't only involve caring for the data, but also involve caring for the people and the communities from which the data come, being committed to building relationships with them, and so on and so forth. And maybe just one anecdotal example from my own work. I've been interviewing recently. I became very interested in the activists who are working to collect data to try to counter feminicide in various contexts. And we've been conducting interviews with them. And so many of these data activists have a deep sense of care for their data. Like they are fastidious and just committed, and they often work with families of folks who have been killed by gender-based violence. And so, you know, one of the things I've been appreciating is like the deep sense of care and responsibility that these activists are bringing to that work. And that's something that we often don't find, you know, in like a, I don't know, random data set of, I don't know, potholes in the city or something like that, you know? But I think it's like a level of attending to something and paying attention to it as a grounded phenomenon that is a more ecological conception of the data, a more grounded conception of the data, than just like, oh, we've got the facts, so let's analyze them, which is a really different mindset. So, yeah.
Thank you both for those really comprehensive answers. I just wanted to mention that it is no mistake that our workshops after the panels deal with principles just that was just outlined. We have a panel that's hosted by Lady Smith going over more in-depth applications of feminist data governance. We also have making sure your documentation is equitable to the populations that you collect data on, as well as inclusion of data with people with disabilities and how the best practices surrounding that. Lastly, we have a workshop on challenging the binary and current hierarchies of thinking about what gender is. So this is all to say I'm really excited for the rest of this conversation, and I really hope to see you all participants here, not only at this panel, but at our workshops as well. So moving on to the next question, it's really an expansion off the first. It's how have you implemented feminist data governance in your work? So kind of examples of application and things that you have done. So Lorena, back to you.
Yeah. So yeah, I'll give an example with respect to the second design principle that I mentioned, which is do not collect data for data's sake, or because a donor demands it. So for us, this is really, I think Catherine put it perfectly. It's about remaining really vigilant against some of the more extractivist tendencies that can accompany data collection, or, you know, if we're going to get out of the data framing, just research. Extractivism historically has accompanied research about marginalized populations. So it's about remaining really vigilant against those tendencies, and again, asking ourselves, you know, the why do you want or need to collect this data, according to who, establishing how the data, if it is indeed collected, will be connected to medium and long-term change, and mapping that out in advance. You know, this isn't something I think that should be reverse engineered, because at the end of the day, particularly with vulnerable communities and with sensitive issues like gender-based violence, the responsibility is entirely on you, the data collector or researcher, to make sure that's mapped out well in advance. So, you know, a bit more of a concrete example of how we've worked through that principle of don't collect data for data's sake is on a number of occasions, Ladysmith, through the project Cosas de Mujeres, has received requests from some of our donors to collect additional data points about the women who message Cosas de Mujeres. And it's not for, I don't want to say for nefarious reasons. I think sometimes there's a lack of visibility of some donors of like the intricacies of programming and projects on the ground. And so, for example, we've been asked, can we do follow-up with the women who message us? And we've had to, thoughtfully push back and explain that there's actually no rationale for collecting follow-up information in this context. At least not in a way that would align with feminist or rights-based imperatives to do no harm and center the rights of the quote-unquote data subjects. And in this example, that's because there's absolutely no way of knowing if the woman who messaged us is still in possession of her phone. There's no way of knowing that. And there's also no way of knowing if, she's currently in a safe environment if we were to reach out again. And I think that is something that we really have to bear in mind as we're entering year one now of lockdown measures that have really shifted the terrain of how you provide support and services to vulnerable communities, and a lot of the gender-based violence prevention and response has shifted online. And so when you're using sort of digital tools to connect women to services or to provide them with support, the assumption cannot be made that that tool is solely the possession of the person who initially engaged with you through that tool. And again, whilst it might be like interesting from a research perspective, what is the aftermath of that engagement with a victim survivor of gender-based violence? Like, did she go to the service that you provided her the information about? Those are all really important questions, but they cannot and should not be gleaned through further interaction on a platform when you can expose that person to more harm. That's when the field research comes in. That's where the connection to local communities and to women's organizations on the ground comes in. That's where being creative and thinking, no, I don't need to reach out to this vulnerable person. I can reach out to the service provider and ask, have you seen an uptick in the numbers of women accessing your service? And again, yes, it's not going to be a perfectly causal analysis you'll be able to draw from that, but it's certainly going to be rich. And in the process, you're going to have limited potentially further harm being done to vulnerable communities. And so again, I think it's this question of always asking the why of data collection and recognizing that you actually are the one that's responsible and accountable to the communities from which that data is, being generated. And again, I think that's why for us, even though we wear academic hats as researchers, the part about being advocates and recognizing that is actually the most important part in the course of this interaction, not what our research interests are, even as like wanting to affect long-term transformative feminist change in how we do gender-based violence response. At the end of the day, the short-term immediate harm reduction needs are paramount, and they have to supersede any other interest that you might have as a researcher.
Thank you.
Thanks. That's fantastic. Thank you. So for me, in terms of implementing feminist data governance, maybe I'll sort of do a contrast about this current work in progress right now. So like I said, so at my lab, we're working with, it's a collaboration between my lab and then two other folks, both based in Latin America. And we came together around this idea of feminicide counter data collection and a kind of interest in thinking about what can folks outside of government. One of our partners actually does work with governments in Latin America around feminicide data, but she's also, and the organization is also interested in efforts from civil society. There are, in the book, we tell the story of Maria Salguero, who's in Mexico, who now has been collecting data for like 5 years about feminicide that she gathers from news reports. It turns out there's many Maria Salgueros in many different countries. There's folks who are located in kind of nonprofits, there's feminist collectives, there's individuals, there's networks, and so on. And so maybe to contrast sort of, to say what hopefully you don't mind me using the term big dick data, but the big dick data is something that we define in the book as like the kind of traditional big data way of doing things. So like the big dick data way to approach feminicide data would have been for me as a professor at an elite institution in the global north to be like, okay, we're going to build the global observatory of feminicide data, and then to like automate that and try to do it for every single country in the entire world. And then, which if you will think about that, kind of what that does is to erase the work that's already happening in terms of collecting that data, and also to erase the many, what we've now learned from interviews is like extremely varied definitions, very kind of like artisanal data collection practices that match the collection environment and the media environment in which people are doing that collection work. So all of that would have been sort of eclipsed. All the credit and attention would have come to me or MIT or whatever, kind of re-inscribing that like norm from the global, look, the global north like solves the problems of the world or whatever. And so like, what do we do that's not that? I think is again important to think about. And so what we did is basically we started by saying, well, let's talk to people, so like let's interview the folks who are doing this data collection work. And through that, we've learned that we've done like 15 interviews with 15 different groups at this point. And there are groups based in North America. There are some groups in the US in particular, and we haven't interviewed folks in Canada, but there are efforts in Canada. And then the majority are in Latin America. And in fact, there are a lot of similarities in the way that these groups are collecting data. And there's some also shared needs in terms of like almost everybody articulated feeling sort of isolated in the work, and everyone's sort of cobbling together different sort of tech tools to do the work. And so where that's led us, and we implemented a co-design process where we're working with 2 different groups, one in the US and one in Uruguay, to co-design tools to support this activist labor. And so that's sort of where this has led us. So we're designing technology in collaboration with the people who are already doing this work, who know their context, like both their media environment that they're collecting data from and their sort of like on the ground geographic context much better than outsiders would ever be able to know it. And also often work they often have connections to government policy, sometimes to law enforcement as well. And so our question has less been about how do we become the global hub of feminicide data, and more about how do we support the extremely valuable but also precarious labor of activists who are working to try to hold governments accountable in this space. And then that has surfaced then like the need for not just sort of tech infrastructure, which folks have agreed that would certainly help, or actually we're piloting tools this spring to hopefully they will help, but also the need for this sort of question of social infrastructure and capacity building. And so from that, we're like, oh, okay, well, we need to not only build these tech tools that people can use, but then also start to form a network of folks who can be talking to each other, because it's clear there's like a huge appetite for this. So myself and the 2 collaborators, we produced an event series last November called Data Against Feminicide, or Datos contra Feminicidio, where we gathered folks, and I think everyone had a very productive set of conversations around, and once the activists start talking to each other, you can't stop them in a way, because like everyone's like, well, here's how I do this, here's my definition of feminicide, what database do you use, how do you find the images of people, there's like lots of things to talk about there. And so just to say that like that's I mean, this is a total work in progress right now, but it's just, we're trying to proceed with these principles of like, you know, valuing labor, valuing many voices at the table, working against extractivism, working in collectivity and collaboration, and all of those things to try to think about like, what would this, yeah, like this to me is like a kind of emerging model of feminist data governance, I guess.
Thank you. So my next question is drawn directly from data feminism. Here it's text is a little small, but we have the principles outlined in data feminism, and I want to actually focus on 2 of these 7. So the first and second, examine power and challenge power. So how does one begin to examine and challenge power at the individual level within our own work and our organizations? So what are some actionable strategies that an individual can employ potentially even today? And I'm going to hand this to Catherine first.
Sure. Yeah, thanks for highlighting those, because actually when we do talks about data feminism, we actually say, hey, look at these 2 principles and look at the fact that there's 2 about power specifically. And I think that's very important, and that's what we've, you know, we get these questions sometimes, they're like, why is data feminism different from just good data science? And then our answer to that is like, it's these 2 principles, which are to examine power and to challenge power, primarily because this kind of analysis of power is at the root of the feminist project. So like feminism is committed to analyzing forces of inequality and then also challenging those forces. There's this like kind of commitment to political action. And so the sneaky thing about power is that it shows up everywhere, right? And this is the this is what's hard about doing this work, because it shows up. And in our book, this is also why we draw from what's called the matrix of domination, which is a model of power that comes out of Black feminism, and specifically the work of Patricia Hill Collins. And what we like about that model of power is that it's multi-scalar. So it talks about interpersonal, the kind of interpersonal domain of power, how we may experience, you know, microaggression or something like this, or a sexist comment. But then it also talks about 3 other domains, like sort of the structural domain, the disciplinary domain. So structural is like laws, disciplinary domain is sort of how those laws get implemented, and then hegemonic domain, which is like media, culture, these kinds of sort of oppressive ideas. And so what that is nice for is that becomes a kind of framework that you can say, well, like, let's look across this particular domain and say, well, like, okay, here's where the interpersonal inequality shows up, here's where the cultural inequalities show up, here's where the structural inequalities show up, and here's where the disciplinary inequalities show up. And a lot of this starts with our own organizations, and as you said, so like, I think that's where it becomes important to start looking at how the structures of our own organizations that we sit within reinforce these oppressive systems. And again, it's like, again, calling our attention to not only just, oh, that person was racist in that interaction, but like, this is a system that reinforces white supremacy and racism, right? And so sort of thinking about what are the micro practices that lead to that reinforcement. And so that can be looking at everything from, you know, like for me in my institution right now, we're thinking a lot about racial justice. Like that can be looking at things like hiring, admissions, that can be looking at these micro interactions that happen between faculty and students at the level of the classroom. That can look like what kinds of who you uphold in a classroom setting as being a model of good practice, who's invited, who's on the syllabus, who are you citing. All of these are ways that we are kind of like modeling the world that we want to see. And so, yeah, sorry, I feel like I'm talking a lot. But basically like power is everywhere. And like, I think that is one of the most, the hugest feminist literacies that we can continually be trying to educate ourselves on, is to like examine that power and see how it shows up in our like not only calling it out in the world, but looking at how it shows up in our institutions. And because those are ultimately the spaces that we have greater leverage to change. Like we can name it in the world, but like how do we name it in our institutions, and how do we name it in ourselves so that we can start to challenge it?
That's great. Thank you. Lorena, how about you?
Yeah, I mean, I think I was thinking a lot about this, reflecting actually just on the question, on the responses I've given so far. And I keep sort of saying co-design and talk to local women's movements and feminist organizations. And I do want to clarify here that when I say that, I don't mean go and lean on unpaid labor in the spaces and contexts that you want to work. That is absolutely not feminist, and actually very, very harmful, and a grotesque, I think, abuse of power to lean on unpaid labor in that way. And so one of, for us, again, the actual like practical, how do you implement feminist data principles in the sort of principle, let's say, of co-design? Well, again, that means that you actually integrate them as core members of your team. And that's what we've done at Ladysmith. We have a group of extraordinary Colombiana and Venezolana women who come from grassroots feminist organizations who have become key members of the broader team. And we co-author op-eds in local newspapers with them. We co-author policy briefs for donor audiences with them. It's not just sort of this like performative like alliance or co-design. It's like, okay, but how? What are the actual concrete steps you've taken? We've also, we know we have more human and actual capital at Ladysmith because we are mostly global North feminists, and we have had the privilege of going to high impact institutions, and so we've learned how to speak the donor speak, and so we always offer sort of our time to support with like doing applications for grants for local feminist organizations that work with us. So that's sort of like, and I think one of the principles of like co-design is actually draws from a really rich tradition in disability rights activism, which is no research about us without us. And so it's about like operationalizing that in really concrete ways, and recognizing, as Catherine put it so well, like every context is different. It's shaped and constrained by different forces, and the priorities of local movements in terms of data collection are going to differ. And not just because of what really is, certainly like all of my academic research and advocacy work has been around femicide and in Guatemala, which is where my family is from. And one of the reasons actually why in my academic work, I've somewhat pushed back on this notion that, we can have a sort of global framework for which variables are important to think about with femicide data collection, is because the contexts are so different, but also risks of data collection are so different. And not certainly Catherine and Lauren said this in their book, and feminists for decades have been saying this, like visibility isn't always good. And Natalia, you touched on this, but like the ways in which vulnerable communities and subjects are made visible is what really matters. And certainly like in Guatemala, for example, femicide is very visible in terms of mainstream media reporting. It's not as if it's like this hidden thing. What's hidden is the actual driving forces for it, which are entrenched patriarchy, racism, and classism. And so I think this is all to go back to like the question of like, when you're working on a particular issue for research or programming or advocacy purposes, like who are you listening to? Who are you engaging? And all of that labor has to be, well, upfront, a lot of that labor has to take place, but it has to, it's not like a linear thing. It's not a checklist. It has to be like cyclical, that you're constantly like revisiting like the parameters you've landed on or the principles you've landed on, and ask like, do we have to pivot? Because of an exogenous event like COVID, do we need to change what our parameters are for what counts as important data? Like I think my brilliant colleagues are going to talk about this later this morning with the workshop. But when COVID hit, one of the things we realized is how can we justify asking women for their neighborhood location, which was one of the ways that we would identify the closest service that we had ground truth with feminist partners that it was a good service, but the closest service that we could send her to. With everything moving online and so many things closing, we couldn't rationalize why we needed that data point beyond like it's interesting and certainly important for a longer term kind of advocacy of policy or service provision perspective. But in the short term, there was no rationale. And so I think it's, again, recognizing that you're never going to land at some like perfect approach to feminist data governance, and you have to kind of be rigorous and willing to put in the work. It's an ideal that you never really arrive at, and that has to be okay.
Thank you so much, both of you, for those answers. I'm actually going to return to our same graphic from Data Feminism here. So this question will actually highlight the fourth principle listed, the one in yellow, rethinking binaries and hierarchies. So in a similar vein, how can we rethink binaries and hierarchies in our work and furthermore in our everyday lives? So Catherine, you may answer first.
Sure. Yeah, I think for that one, I think one of the things we wanted to push back on, through the inclusion of that is that, there has been so much feminist work that has examined the gender binary as a kind of very specific system, meaning like this idea that we inherit that there are only two genders, and that there's like men and women, and that in fact, a lot of feminist work has worked to show how, first of all, there's not two things, that's actually a hierarchy, like men are here and women are here. But then also it's a false binary, because actually there's far more than two genders, right? And I've recently been looking into the history of the gender binary, and sort of specifically like heteropatriarchy as like a Western European colonial export, like it's like we're living in this conception of gender that is like 500 years old, that has also been used as a tool of domination. And so how do we free ourselves from that conception, and from that legacy of domination to some extent? And so I think for us, one of the things that we say is that whenever we encounter binaries, and it's like a pretty typical feminist move, then you say, well, like, how is this binary potentially false? How is it potentially obscuring a more multiple truth? And then how is it also potentially hiding a hierarchy? So whenever we encounter things like, because there's lots of binaries, especially in Western thought. So like, reason and emotion, nature and culture, body and world. And so like, how are those things actually obscuring the truth and obscuring our ability to, in a way, like relate ethically to the world? And so I think if we're bringing this to the level of data, this means always, like if we're thinking about gender data, this means always having a multiple, like a non-binary construction and idea of what gender is, even if like you end up collecting gender in the gender data in the binary, because sometimes that there's still a good reason to do that. But thinking really holistically about why you make that choice, and doing the research to understand what you're obscuring and who you're obscuring when you do that. And then I'll just say one of my critiques, I would say, of the international development space is often when we say gender data, we mean women's data. And so like, and I think we need to think hard about that, because it's not only women who have a gender, men also have a gender, and trans and non-binary people and two-spirit folks and like all other folks, like almost everybody has a gender, although I guess there's agender folks too who maybe don't have a gender. But so like, how is our schema supporting these multiple identities, and also the ways in which different identities potentially place people at more risk of harm, stigma, and marginalization. So, so I think that's one thing. And then when we say hierarchies, it's that, yeah, like kind of paying attention to how those hierarchies seep into the data collection process, especially in our categorization schemes. You know, and this is going to happen. You know, I think there is data, in a sense, by definition, are a reduction of the world. Like, you are trying to capture something from the world and categorize it in a specific way. And like, one exercise I do with my students is I like send them out into the neighborhood. Well, back when we had, you know, back when we could be together, you know, send them out into the neighborhood and say, you know, classify something, like collect something, like data about cars, data about shoes, data about doors, or something like that. And you quickly realize, just like, it's very hard to develop a classification scheme. And then every classification scheme is going to have gray areas, right? And so to a certain extent, you have to deal with that data are a reduction of the world. They will never capture the beautiful, you know, gray complexity of everything. But on the other hand, you need to make sure that your categories are ethical and they're not, you know, needlessly erasing people out of existence just because you're too ignorant to know that they exist. So yeah, that's sort of the motivation for that particular principle.
That's great. Thank you so much, Lorena.
Yeah, I think Catherine covered the ground really well. One of the things I'll just say is that I remember this conversation with Tara when we started Ladysmith, and one of the driving reasons that we wanted to start Ladysmith was because the reduction of gender data to sex disaggregated statistics or to quantitative data was a really clear driving force in some bad policy, but also in the invisibilization of women's stories and the stories of vulnerable communities, and the reduction of like qualitative research and data to like anecdotal, nice kind of color for the real data, which are the graphs and the stats and all that. And we were really like, we have to rebalance the data scales, because who are the organizations and groups that tend to have the in-house technical and resource capacity to source or collect the kind of quantitative data or to do the quantitative research? You know, again, leans global north. And then what does it, and one of my favorite feminist scholars, Donna Haraway, you know, talks a lot about this, as do other researchers, but what is it saying when we're reducing qualitative data to sort of, you know, just anecdote? You're saying something very ideological about stories and about, you know, what is lost. I mean, again, looking back at the example of femicide data, I remember looking at data about the numbers of women who counted amongst the victims of femicide in Guatemala, and that's always an undercount for so many reasons that I don't have time to get into, but also what you needed was to triangulate that with stories and understanding of the context and conditions and the victims' families and how it had affected them, and that it wasn't just, a femicide doesn't just kill one person, that the ripple effects are ones that you need to think of data in this like rich multi-textual way in order to get a picture that, even as Catherine said, is never going to be the picture, because data is reductionist and research has to reduce, it has to in the end finalize on something. And that's why researchers will always tell you, or academics, that they're never quite happy with the work because they know they've had to, you know, cut the fat, as we're told by editors. And one of the things I really love, that Tara and I found this incredible quote in this book, and it's about the verb contar, which is the verb in Spanish of to tell, but it also means to count. And so it's this idea that contar is not just about counting inequalities through, let's say, sex disaggregated statistics, which are obviously super reductionist, but it's also about telling stories, and that's the qualitative piece. And so I think if you think of gender data as through the Spanish verb contar, you get a much kind of better horizon for what you should be aiming for when you are doing this work. And I'll stop there with that.
Thank you both so much for that. I'm just so excited for the rest of the day because we will potentially have more time to delve into it. There's no way that we can capture everything within less than an hour. I originally wanted to have time for audience questions. We still will be very thoughtful, and I will definitely circle back with Lorena and Catherine with the questions that you have asked. Thank you so much for your engagement in the chat. I promise you that I definitely looked at all of them, and I will be logging them. I want to close today's panel with one more kind of question / comment for each of our panelists today. If the audience were to take away one thing from, which I realize now, like we said, that could potentially be reductionist in and of itself, but just one key takeaway from today's session, what would it be? So Lorena, what would it be?
Oh, sorry, for me first? Sorry, I didn't hear. I think just that feminist data governance does not need to be a zero-sum game. Like, there is no gold standard. There's no checkbox that's like, hey, now we're feminist. There's a ton of gray space, but feminist principles ask us to not just flake around and use that gray space as an excuse for non-action. So yeah, I think that would be, read, learn, look at those who are already doing this work, and recognize that it's going to be like a non-linear process. This is not a catchy slogan. It encompasses thoughtful principles and meaningful iteration. And meaningful iteration ultimately hinges on having a substantive grounding in the spaces and communities from which data is going to be collected. And just to encourage listeners to tune into the 10:30 Eastern workshop with my colleagues, who are going to be able to do a lot more of the how with the audience rather than the what, which I've been doing a lot of in terms of what is feminist data governance. They're going to take us through a little bit more of the how. Thanks.
Thank you. And Catherine.
Yeah, thanks. I think for me, one of the through lines of this conversation has been about co-design, which Lorena mentioned, and which we talk about in data feminism under that principle of embrace pluralism, but really thinking about co-design as a way of being accountable. And so maybe, and that's like a way to enter some of those who questions, like, who are you collecting data about, for whom, who's benefiting, who's harmed. And I really think of that process of co-design as a way of, it's an accountability mechanism, which we often don't have in our, in academic research, we have IRBs, but those are designed in many ways to protect the institution from legal liability. They're not necessarily designed to help us truly be accountable to the people that we're working with as research subjects or research participants. So I think like co-design as a path to accountability, but then also think about what are other structures and ways of being accountable to the communities that you see yourself serving, and like truly accountable, meaning they have some power over you and some say in where your thing goes. So yeah.
Thank you so much. So I know that there's definitely a lot more to say, but I wanted to thank both of our panelists today, Lorena and Catherine. You two have been so pivotal for even my learnings in gender data, and I hope to continue to collaborate. And I can see from the chat that everyone really appreciated today. So thank you all. We will be right after this, actually, in a couple of minutes. Anna Lerner, who is a program manager at Facebook, will be hosting our synthesis and application showcase. So I will tune to that very soon. But thank you to our panelists once again, and I hope to see you there, which is same main stage, just new video.
Thank you.